Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to another episode of Not Another Digital Marketing Podcast. I'm your host, Rafie, together with my co-host, could not get that out properly, together with my awesome co-host in Hong Kong, Mr. Aaron Ratcliffe. How are you doing, sir?
You know what, Rafie? It has been a little bit of a stressful week. I think everyone's feeling it in some capacity, but I'm doing well.
You're doing well. That's good. That's good to know.
How about you?
I feel like I'm carrying the existential dread, stress, and emotional labor of many of my US-based friends right now. In terms of current events, there's a little thing happening right now. Not sure if everybody is aware that there's this small election going on in this former British colony happening out west. Yeah, and it's kind of.
I've heard nothing about this.
No, you haven't heard anything about it? Well, that's great because we're going to talk about it, right? We're going to be discussing it. Yeah. So welcome to today's episode, everybody. Where we are going to be marketing the US election, or should we contextualize that further? We're going to be talking about the marketing of the US election. And so just top of the program notes for everybody that's listening in. We will not be talking about our personal politics or specific candidate policies and ideologies, right? That is completely off the table. And we will be focusing on marketing related aspects of this election cycle and the numbers that are involved. I mean, that's safe.
Yeah. The whole point of this is, we're a marketing podcast and we don't just want to give you guys, boring tips on how to increase this in your campaigns. And we'll do stuff like that. But every now and then it's kind of nice for us to talk about things that are happening in the world. And one thing that we coined with this podcast is that we want to look at life through the lens of a marketer. And right now, life has a really important election going on, and elections require an enormous amount of marketing. We'll get into some of the raw numbers a little bit later. Just in terms of a marketing campaign, this election as a whole has just been absolutely fascinating to watch. And there's a lot of things that we can learn as marketers that we can apply to our own marketing campaigns. So we're not going political with this. We're just strictly analyzing. I actually wore my analyzing glasses today. These are my fake glasses, but because we're talking about politics, I wanted to feel more intelligent and look smarter. How do I look? Do I look smart?
You look spiffy, my friend.
Nice. Nailed it.
Awesome. Yeah. So I actually need these glasses. These are not put on. These are actually prescriptions. So, it's not an affectation, but let's dive into it. But before we really do dive into it, just want to say to all of the new listeners out there that we would love to hear from you. So please make sure to visit our LinkedIn, right, where you can find us at First Page Digital, and let us know how we can help you today. Be sure to check out our websites, either at www.firstpagedigital.sg for Singapore or www.firstpage.hk for our Hong Kong team, so that we can find ways to help you supercharge your online business. Okay, now that we got that out of the way, let's dive right into it.
Let's dive.
Okay, so we've come up with a format here that should be easy for everybody listening to this to follow. We're going to talk about, first of all, the personal branding of each of the candidates. Then we're going to go into the campaign strategy and campaign spending. And then we're going to conclude by talking about the overall platform or party branding that each of the candidates have aligned themselves with for the US election 2020 cycle. So let's start. Let's kick this off. Aaron, I'm going to let you take the lead on this one. How has Trump defined himself in the eyes of the electorate? How has Biden defined himself in the eyes of the electorate?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So whether a presidential election or marketing your own product, there's an element of personal branding that always goes into this. And it's so crucial because that's where you make that emotional connection and you get to brand yourself and market yourself in a certain way. And both of these candidates have chosen very specific ways that they're choosing to market and to brand themselves. And they're ways that are probably pretty obvious. What you think about Trump, his we'll say, for lack of a better word, strengths and weaknesses, and same thing with Biden, his own strengths and weaknesses. And they're sort of playing to their own strengths and weaknesses, maximizing their strengths, minimizing their weaknesses. So Trump, like I said, we're going to keep our personal opinions out of this, but it's definitely, I think, undeniable to say that Trump has always marketed himself as strong and decisive. He is the anti-politician. He's uncorruptible by his own words, but really personal branding with Trump is just really strength, just like determined, just like this epitome of strength. I keep using the word strength over and over again, but I think that that's just at the core of his personal branding. But the interesting part is to see sort of Biden, who in some ways is not an antithesis to that, but really markets himself in a sort of different way. Not that Biden wouldn't be considered strong necessarily, but Biden's like an empathetic sort of a perspective, sympathetic. You see his advertisements where he gets emotional or he'll get teary-eyed, and you could just never in a bajillion years imagine Trump having like a commercial where he's like retrospectively thinking about something that happened in his life before, and like a single tear rolls down his face. Like, the man's incapable probably of that. So we really have an enormous disparity in their personal branding, and it sort of it made the campaign very interesting because you have these two candidates who are sort of projecting different things. Trump, strong and decisive, and Biden, as you put in the notes here, Rafie, which I like, as sort of the kind grandfather. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think Trump also, he's played the personal branding game for so long.
He's a master of it in so many ways,
and like he's traded on that for the longest time, and fair play to him for being able to find some measure of success and notoriety that way. I mean, success to the point that he became president of the United States, right?
Yeah, pretty. It worked.
Yeah, and he says that he's a successful businessman, and and it must be the case because he's got all of these properties, his name's everywhere, that kind of thing, right? And that's how he's managed to reach a certain reach the American people in the sense that this is what success outwardly looks like, and he defines it that way, and he is a success by his very own definition, and he's been so good at contextualizing his achievements on his own terms, right, that very few people can take on those terms and come out on top if they try to have a disagreement with how he positions himself. That to me is masterful. It shows a very, very keen awareness of the importance of very strong and very clear messaging.
Yeah, dude, 100%. That was really well said. And yeah, say what you want about Trump, but he definitely understands branding, and the way that he has branded himself over the years, from sort of like a playboy billionaire to the swamp cleaner president. But still, there's been that sense of like unapologeticness to him, of like sort of excess of sort of, I'm right and there's no other options out there, and for many people that's sort of a representation of strength in a lot of ways, and it's been his branding and he's stuck to it. So it's been interesting to see his campaign, but also on the antithesis with Biden, the kind grandfather.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Biden though. He's I suppose like he has his brand is sort of like a nurturing masculinity type, right? Where it's sort of he's not getting caught up in in whether or not he's a nurturing figure. He says and he shows that he's a nurturing figure, right? And he's meant to be this center of he positions himself as an avatar of healing, as the conscience of the country, so to speak. Like that's what he has positioned himself as, and I guess we'll see whether it works or not, depending on the results, right?
Time will tell. And it should be worth noting, actually, as of recording this, the election results are still up in the air. So we actually do not know who has won yet. So it kind of adds an interesting element to our discussion because we don't know who won. So it's actually even more interesting to kind of, analyze their different marketing strategies.
Yeah. And in Biden's case, there was... there in the earlier parts of his campaign, you could say that there was a bit of confusion as to who is Joe Biden and what does he stand for, right? Because the early candidates had very strong branding as well. When you talked about Elizabeth Warren and her catchphrase, "I have a plan for that." You talked about Bernie Sanders and saying that, Bernie Sanders was a very out and proud socialist Democrat, right? And he labeled himself that, and he was very clear about his branding and messaging. And Joe was sort of, not really sure about how he positioned himself. He's a centrist, he's a moderate, yes, but does he have the force of personality to become a strong candidate? And ultimately, I feel like he has defined his personal branding as, like you said, basically the antithesis of Donald Trump. And that's that seems to be strong enough to make it a very competitive contest across the board. So
yeah, dude, definitely. And it's interesting to see as marketers too, just like, Trump's sort of style versus Biden's style. Like, sometimes a Trump sort of message where you are sort of going strong, going very, very, very to your core and trying to speak to them and to energize them. Sometimes that could be very effective, for a product or a campaign. Sometimes though, a more broad message, just trying to go straight down the middle, appeal to as many people as possible can also be effective. So there's things to learn on both sides of the campaign. And we should probably use that then to segment to our next about campaign strategies.
Yeah, that's a great segue actually, because we're going to talk about I think one last word on the personal branding, right? Because I think we do encounter brands that talk about how they need to shout or they need to constantly beat their target markets over the head with who they are and what they are, right? And sometimes it works. Sometimes people just need to be constantly reminded of what a brand's strength is. And that's sort of like what Trump does. Consistent messaging all the time, and it's always very loud. You cannot ignore Donald Trump. You will always hear what his message is. Versus Joe, who's a bit more, a bit more laid back, a bit more, a bit more, not to say subtle, because you can't be subtle in a presidential election, but sort of like, a bit more reserved or a bit quieter in that sense. So, yeah.
Yeah, he was definitely trying to be lower key. I think a lot of the strategy for the Biden campaign was to let Trump bury himself. I'm sure, they were just like, let him talk. That's what they were kind of hoping would happen. And they just kind of stay in the background a little bit. And I think they took a less is more sort of approach, at least when it came to like public speaking and like doing interviews and stuff like that, as opposed to Trump, who was just like in your face, I am here. This is my brand. So really two very different strategies there.
Yeah, and that's a segue into our second segment, campaign strategy. You've kicked that off already, Aaron, talking about how mentioned earlier about the different kinds of messaging and the different kinds of targeted messaging that they had. You want to dive into that?
Yeah, man. Well, I mean, specifically, like, let's just talk about great branding is really about making that emotional connection, and Trump's campaign really hit the nail on the head, I think, in terms of trying to get their base excited, and making that emotional connection. I think that, there wasn't a broader sort of strategy with Trump. I think it was just getting his base amped up so they would go to the polls and they would vote. So yeah, it's really about energizing his fans, and really anything extra was sort of a bonus. And you can kind of see it with like their slogans, So for instance, in the election versus Hilary Clinton in 2016, Trump's iconic slogan, "Make America Great Again," right? And MAGA, it just rolls off the tongue nicely. Phenomenal branding on their part with that. This election was quite interesting because they actually tried to change to "Keep America Great," and then I found this out. The Biden campaign found out that keepamericagreat.com domain was actually available, and they bought it. So the Biden campaign owned keepamericagreat.com. So then Trump was furious. And also, Keep America Great isn't quite as exciting as like MAGA, like the whole MAGA, that's the base likes, so Trump, for a few reasons decided to leave Keep America Great, and then he went back to MAGA, Make America Great Again, because that's what the base likes, That's the consistency of branding right there. So I thought that was a really interesting sort of situation. Another interesting thing that I was reading about the actual campaigns is, in any political campaign, it's negative ads do very well. Painting your opponent in a negative perspective is very efficient when it comes to political advertisements. But how negative the ads are, I think, is quite interesting. So according to, I think it was CNBC, did an evaluation of all of Trump's television ads, and he had an extremely high negative to positive ratio, as to where over 80% of his ads were actually more based on like attacks and had a more negative tone, as opposed to Biden, who still had a majority negative ads, but they were 60%. So yet again, you're kind of seeing this disparity between the two campaigns, between Trump really just going for those emotions, going hard, because Trump is just, he's a bull, dude. He's just attack, 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 right? And he's stuck with that branding, and that was the campaign strategy, was just to go really hard in the paint, as we say in the States.
Yeah, I don't think if Trump was a basketball player, he'd be like 7'7" and he'd just be posting up all the time. He'd be doing the Shaq thing. Like,
yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. He'd be Shaq, just bullying people in the paint, talking smack the whole time. So yeah, Trump is Shaq.
And I guess when we look at Biden, right? Like, the interesting thing that I saw. I mean, okay, I'm not American. I'm an emotionally invested, like, third-party observer in this case, right? So I did get a lot of the Biden messaging coming through from my friends, who are ardent Biden supporters, and to me, Biden was trying to build a coalition. He was trying to be broader in his messaging. He was trying to reach more people, rather than just targeting, say, the traditional Democrat base, whoever that Democrat base is. And actually trying to reach across, cultural and ideological lines to try and have far broader. I hesitate to use the word generic, but sort of like slightly less targeted language in his messaging when it came to his campaign strat.
Definitely, dude. It's like what we were saying earlier, where the Trump campaign was a little bit more narrow and very aggressive. Biden's campaign was a little more broad. It was a little bit more middle of the road. They weren't trying to fire anybody up, really, in comparison to the Trump campaign. But in essence, they were trying to appeal to a broader audience. I think that they were trying to market themselves as an alternative to Trump. It's like, hey, if you are sick and tired of what's been happening the past 4 years with the aggressive insanity that is the Trump campaign, and which is Trump's personality, I offer you a more calm and tranquil sort of experience in contrast to that. So that was sort of their strategy. That was sort of their messaging, because he didn't talk a lot about policy. It's like what you said. You knew where Elizabeth Warren was going. You know where Bernie Sanders was going. Those are two very policy-driven politicians. I don't think Trump is a very policy-driven politician. I think he's an emotional politician and a great marketer. But he did talk a lot about policy on the campaign. Not as much as Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders would have necessarily, but there was definitely talk about policy. As to where Biden kind of kept the policy stuff kind of like, we'll talk about policy later. Let's just get Trump out of office first. So it was really crossing those ideological lines, as you said, but in a way that's like a calmer alternative to Trump. And
was that sort of like
more narrow, a broader appeal?
Okay. Like let me throw a little bit of a cat amongst the pigeons here. Like, could you then make the argument? Could we then make the argument or the inference that, Biden's approach this time was, sort of like a response to, the way that Hillary Clinton's messaging was rejected 4 years ago? Because, as we know, Clinton was also super heavy on policy. She wasn't necessarily, a strong character or a strong personality herself, right? And she did campaign a lot on policy before. Could this have been the Democrats learning those lessons from 4 years ago, saying that,
dude, that's actually a really good observation, and I hadn't actually considered that, but I definitely think that that's a really good observation.
Because I feel like like Clinton was always like a bit like Elizabeth Warren light, or Elizabeth Warren diet Elizabeth Warren, in the sense that, like, she had a plan for everything, and she had all of these like great policy ideas and whatnot that maybe great for her, or she brands them great policy ideas, at the time. But then, it was sort of like, it just didn't reach the base that Trump managed to energize with his far more emotional, outreach, right? I feel like that was a telling factor 4 years ago. And it might be a factor this time around, where Biden sort of like, yes, we understand the pain that you're coming from, and that's what his campaign is about, like telling people we're an alternative. Like, yes, we understand emotionally where everybody's coming from, but we don't have to react in the same way that Donald Trump's campaign is reacting.
Sure. And also another thing that's made me think of is like, Hillary's campaign, I think would be a little bit more on the left and Biden's was a little bit more centrist. Yeah. And I think that also works to their favor as well, because the further left Hillary pushed, the further it pushed people to the right sometimes. So I think, and, different election cycles, sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think the Biden campaign just saw that, and they were like, we don't want to push people to the right. So the more center we stay, the more votes that we can attract.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, I think they were worried in that sense that the messaging for them, it really needed to appeal much broader than it did before. I think it's like we can make the argument that America's market, that America as a market is changing, it's evolving all the time, right? And perhaps the messaging and the targeting that the Clinton campaign tried to carry out 4 years ago just didn't reflect the reality that they thought they saw with their data, which is also a good lesson in for us, because we need to always remind ourselves that data doesn't tell us everything.
100%, dude. 100%.
Right. And speaking of data, see the segue there?
Nicely done. You're good at this.
Oh, man. Yeah.
Teach
Angel
me your
of words, right? Was that the Angel of Optimism? Wordsmith. Yeah. I think that's my nickname. Where were we? Yes. When we talk about data, I believe you have some very interesting pieces of data to share with us regarding.
Yeah, so we're moving into the next chapter of this episode, which is the spending strategy, which as marketers, really interesting to us. Obviously the words that you use and the branding strategies that you use are crucial, but where are you putting the money? We're talking about Jerry Maguire last week. Show me the money, right?
Show me the money.
So let's talk money, because wow, there was a lot of money in this election. I'm actually, according to that I was reading by CNBC, that this election doubled last election. Now this includes the presidential and the Senate and congressional races. So all things combined to hit nearly 14 billion. That's billion with a B dollars in spending from May till October. And that doubles, oh my God, more than doubles. So in 2016, it was about 5 billion. So almost triples the amount of spending. So a lot of money went into this stuff, guys. A lot of money.
Good Lord.
So but it's interesting to see where each campaign spent their money, because, as digital marketers, we're obviously very prone to being very, internet savvy. We think that things like Google Ads and Facebook are the most important things, but it's interesting because there's also other forms of advertising. There's TV ads, Rafie. I forget about TV ads sometimes now that I have Netflix, but these things.
What's a TV?
Well, back in the day, no, but so it's really interesting to see how the breakdown actually happened. So let's see, just looking at my notes right here. Actually, I got my notebook right here. So,
yep.
The Republicans from April until now spent 135 million combined on Facebook and Google advertisements versus the Democrats, who spent 100 million. So quite interesting there.
Okay.
The Republicans actually were more digital marketing savvy than the Biden campaign was, or at least they chose to pour their resources into digital marketing. So I think it's actually quite interesting. And it does make sense because, last week you and I talked about social dilemma and how, a lot of political advertisements are going on there, and the Trump campaign definitely benefited from social media advertising in the previous election. And really, based on what I've read and stuff, it seems like their campaign just has a better understanding of how to utilize social media platforms and digital marketing as a whole. So it makes sense that they put more of their money into that. What are your thoughts?
Which is a neat reversal, actually, because Obama, when he got elected, was built on the back of a very social media energized movement, right?
Absolutely.
And the Obama team definitely knew how to handle social media, especially with Barack Obama's background as a community organizer, how they managed to leverage that far better than the McCain campaign or the Romney campaign did in 2008 and 2012. And now we have a reversal of how, the Republicans are understanding the algorithm a little bit better and knowing where to put their spend.
Yeah,
Versus the Democrats.
it seems like they just are more invested in it. They're hiring smarter people for, and like you can see this throughout the entire Trump campaign, with the Cambridge Analytica situation. So they definitely understand the power of digital marketing, especially on a granular level, to really speak to people individually and emotionally. So quite interesting to see the spend differential there. But as to where Republicans spent 135 million on digital marketing versus Democrats 100 million, Democrats spent 600 million on television ads versus the Republicans 400 million. So pretty consistent. Democrats did a little bit more of a traditional campaign. They did some digital marketing, but not as much as the Republicans, and they stuck to almost 50% increase on the amount of money that the Republicans spent on television ads. So really interesting to see what they did there. But also you could see how that makes sense in a lot of ways with the sort of broad approach versus Trump's more like granular approach and more narrow and emotional approach. Biden's just blasting television ads all across the state like, hey, I'm middle of the road. Vote for me. I'm not Trump. Vote for me. As to where Trump is getting people a little bit more energized and excited, utilizing digital media platforms to his advantage. So it's really interesting to see that difference.
Yeah. And I think also because, a lot of times when it comes to social media, people that already follow you, it's easier to reach them on social because, they're following your page and whatnot, then the cost per impression, I think, is that the right, what's the right metric to use here? Cost per
That was
impression?
correct.
Yeah, cost per impression would be much lower. So a dollar that you spend on social probably goes a lot further than a dollar that you would spend on TV, right? But then
I would think so, yeah. But we can't underestimate the value of a television ad.
For sure.
It still reaches mass amounts of people, and it's still advertising. Advertising is effective in most shapes and forms. Is it as effective as digital marketing? Who knows? Time will tell. If the Trump ends up winning the campaign, maybe their digital marketing savviness could be a reason for that happening.
Yeah. Also, because Biden was trying to win back the older demographic, which abandoned Clinton in 2016, as well. The over 45 demographic voted overwhelmingly for Trump in a lot of the key battleground states, in 2016. So I suppose that was the avenue for him to try and win them back by targeting a channel, specific to this particular segment that he knew that he would have eyeballs on. So I guess that also played into it.
No, it does. And it's interesting too. I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was explaining Trump campaign strategy, how granular both campaigns going, so microscopic and granular. But even Trump is up this election compared to previous election with minority voters. It was like a 4% increase, Latinos, and like a 6% increase for African-American voters. So actually, it looks like the Trump campaign really tried to do more granular sort of marketing towards minorities, where he underperformed last election, and he actually did much better with this election, particularly with in Florida. I think over 50% of Cuban Americans actually ended up voting for Trump. So that was a big turnaround from last time.
Speaking of turnarounds, actually, I think you mentioned something about Arizona, right? Which has essentially flipped.
Yeah,
right?
essentially
From what I understand.
flipped.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting too, because Arizona, traditionally a red state, not even close to being purple, but these things obviously change over time. But looking at a map right now of the ads, of the weekly spending on TV ads for Trump and Biden, and it's just Arizona is the biggest in all of them. They knew that Arizona was a battleground state this year, which is really interesting because the surrounding states, nothing in New Mexico, nothing in Utah, so they knew which way those states were going. So it seems like they had intel. They knew that Arizona could flip either way. And it seems that I believe Arizona went Democrat this year, right?
At the time that we're talking about this, Biden is leading, with about 86% of the votes counted. So, yeah.
Okay. So, so we're not sure who wins Arizona, but looking at the data, they put, let's see, judging by this, it looks like over $10 million a week into Arizona TV ads. So, It's really, but it's interesting because the Biden campaign outspended the Trump campaign in Arizona, and it seemed to work. So, hey, you shove enough ads down people's throats, and sometimes it can have an effect. What's interesting too is even talking about the whole granular is I read a different article where in this last week the Biden campaign was running 38. Don't know why I confused 13 and 38. 38 different ads in Pennsylvania that are specifically targeted for different demographics. So talk about marketing on a very granular level, on a very personal level. They're doing ads not based state by state, but counties within states by states. So just really getting super specific with their targeting. And I'm sure they were doing that with digital marketing as well. Obviously, we have the ability to do that as digital marketers. That's the sort of things that we do on campaigns with First Page that we can get for our clients. And that's what sort of modern marketing allows us to do with these platforms, with all the good and bad that's with them, is that you can get so specific for the type of person that you want to advertise to.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's great having all the data. Now, what do you do with it, right?
Exactly.
Oh, man. Okay, so like, yeah, I guess... that's then, looking at all that money that they spend on, all of these ads, targeting people and like trying to make sure that their messages get across, right? And making sure that they reach the right people that these messages need to reach, right? That's a very important point right there. That then leads us on to our next segue, right? What is the messaging? What is the core of what these parties represent? Like, what is their party branding, right? That's... how do we see as marketers, how these people brand themselves, as in the Republicans and the Democrats?
Yeah.
Oh, Aaron, are you there? Yeah.
I lost you for a second, Rafie.
No, my question to you is that how do you see, because then, we talk about the messaging, right? That's, for example, in Arizona, they've been targeting so specific in terms of like by county or by, even by borough, by district. What actually is the message or the brand that these parties have for themselves, the Republicans and the Democrats? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because we think that, the Democrats and the Republicans have, or all political parties have consistent messaging, but there's actually a lot of fluctuation and political ideas evolve and parties evolve as well, especially in American history. I mean, the Republicans and Democrats have flipped on certain issues over the years. So it's interesting to see it as a marketer that you actually don't need that consistency, that you can pivot with the times. Like if your core audience wants something now, but then that changes later, you can pivot with them. And that's quite interesting, but the Republicans have always been on par with their marketing and their branding of the party of personal responsibility, right? Yeah. It's small government, it's communities, it's family, it's personal responsibility. That's kind of the core of the Republican Party.
It's an easy to remember. It's an easy to remember tagline, isn't it? Like, the party of personal responsibility.
And you nailed it, dude. That's really exactly what it is. If you want to sort of summarize the Republican Party, you could always just kind of say the party of personal responsibility, because that does really encompass or encapsulate or, just kind of the whole thing of what Republicans are about. That's sort of it right there. But it's interesting with the Democrats, they've got a little bit more of a challenge in terms of like their branding, because they don't really have that tagline. Rafie, if I asked you to come up with a tagline for the Democrats, 5 words or less, it's tough, right?
Yeah, it's because there's so many elements in the Democratic Party, and then you have like, I mean, you could identify them by faction, I suppose. You have like the centrists, the moderates, then you have the Democrats, socialists, then you have the progressives, then you have the far left. Yeah, it's a bit, let's use a nice word. Let's say it's super diverse, various
It's one way
parts.
to look at it, it definitely is. I think that I was trying to do this myself earlier. I was like, come with a tagline for the Democratic Party. I think forward thinking could kind of encapsulate their ideas and their beliefs, but at the end of the day, we're having a hard time with it. And that's the interesting part about the marketing between the Republicans and the Democrats, or more traditionals, more conservative people and more progressive people, is that, especially in American politics, the Republican Party has always seen as more unified than the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is always seen as sort of a cohesive unit. Now, they're not really a cohesive unit. They just understand the power of being a cohesive unit. You know,
Yeah. Or the perception of being a cohesive unit. The power of perception.
Yeah. The perception is power, you know? Like, you know, look back to 2016, Trump was running against Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz. And Trump was calling, Lion Ted and little Rubio or something, you know? And he was talking crap about their wives and their looks and just being kind of a crappy person to them. And they were obvious, you know, while they were campaigning against each other, Rubio and Cruz were like, F this guy. But once they lost, they endorsed Trump, and they are Trump fanboys. Through and through at this point, because the party definitely has a sense of unity in it, as opposed to the Democrats, though, where, like you said, Rafie, there's like different factions. You have the centrists / moderates, but then you have more the far left side, and the Democratic Party is kind of split into two in a lot of ways, and this creates a lot of confusion within the Democratic Party. What is the branding? What is the message? Republicans never have this problem. So that's interesting, and that's definitely probably helped Republicans through the years. And there's just takeaways for that, is that consistency of messaging is really important. And if your message is blurred, if your branding isn't concise, it can be confusing.
Definitely. I think, you know, we've gotten to the point where we're like, you know, we're 30 minutes into this, and it's taken this long to even define what being a Democrat is, or what the Democratic Party is supposed to be, right? And it's sort of like, you know, it like you said, it really does suggest that they do have a branding problem, or a consistent branding problem. Like, they're not consistent in who they are.
It reminds me of have you ever seen the film The Ides of March?
I have not. No, I have not. No.
Dude, that is crazy. You're like the biggest cinephile that I know. Like, you love movies. Okay, let me pitch it for you. Ryan Gosling, George Clooney, Philip Seymour Hoffman. First of all, do I need to say any more?
Okay.
Political thriller. It's unbelievable, okay? So George Clooney is running for president on the Democrat side, and Philip Seymour Hoffman is his campaign strategist, and Ryan Gosling is like the vice campaign strategist, or like the vice president. President. He works under Philip Seymour Hoffman, and Philip Seymour Hoffman pulls Ryan Gosling into the room at one point, and he's like, and they're Democrats, and he's like, what you have to understand is that we need to think more like the Republicans. They're more unified than we are. They're smart. We are always on the stage, and this is our problem as a party. And I think that they nailed it. You know, like, that's sort of the antithesis, you know, the epitome of what's happening here with the Democrats, is that sort of they're a little kind of all over the place, and that can be a little confusing, I think, for voters. You know, are they far left? Are they centrist? Right now, it seems working for the Biden campaign. You know, they're definitely pulling in some votes, and it's a close election, but maybe a little bit more consistency and clarity of message could help them out.
I think okay.
I don't want to act like I'm giving campaign advice to the Bidens, but I just gave campaign advice to the Bidens. Clear your message.
Yeah, I think we can also sort of like sum it up. Okay, I've had to think about this, and I suppose the best way to put these parties against each other, to sort of like define their positioning, is to say, you know, it's collectivism versus individualism. I think that's a neat way of just summing it all up, what they are about.
I like that.
Right.
I like that a lot. Yeah, collectivism being more like socialist-based programs, or we'll say social, not socialist, social-based programs, more of a collection of people, versus individualism, which is more the Republican side of things, more conservative thinking, more individual responsibility. I like that.
Yeah, I think that neatly sums it up. And
I think so.
Yeah, and I guess that sums up the episode, really.
Dude, we did a good job. We just did a 30-minute political podcast without anybody screaming at each other, or I don't even know if people could tell our political biases based on this podcast. So comment below if you can guess. Comment below if you can guess which way Rafie and I swing with our politics.
Well, you know, that's the dream, isn't it? To be able to talk about politics and not reveal your political affiliations. So that's fun.
I agree.
All right. Aaron, my friend, thank you so much for spending some time with
Dude, an absolute pleasure. This was a blast. I cannot wait to chat again with you next week.
Yeah, for sure. And for those of you that are listening, thank you so much for taking time out of your day to tune in to this episode of Not Another Digital Marketing Podcast. Be sure to check us out on LinkedIn. Check us out on our web pages at www.firstpagedigital.sg or firstpage.hk. Right? I'm Rafie. He's Aaron Ratcliffe. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll see you in the next one.
Peace.